I sacrificed working hard with 2 jobs to support my sister's education. But when she looked down on me and my family took advantage of me, I decided to stop supporting her to escape the toxic cycle. I was paying for my sister's education by working 2 jobs, but she called me a loser. I never imagined that all my hard work and sacrifices for my sister Lauren would lead to her calling me a loser. But that's exactly what happened at a family dinner, a moment that felt like a slap in the face after years of putting my own life on hold for her. I had been working 2 jobs to pay for her education, rent, utilities, and even the occasional night out when she needed to de-stress. Yet, despite everything I did to support her, she couldn't resist making that cruel comment in front of everyone. When Lauren got into her dream college, my parents were ecstatic. They couldn't stop beaming with pride, and Lauren was already talking about the amazing career she'd have after graduation. Meanwhile, I stood in the corner, quietly calculating how this was going to play out. I knew my parents couldn't afford her tuition. They'd been dropping hints about it for weeks. My mom would say things like, "Lauren is so smart, but college is so expensive these days," while looking directly at me. It didn't take a genius to figure out they were expecting me to step in. At the time, I thought, what's the harm in helping out? She was my sister, after all. It started small, buying textbooks here, groceries there, but before I knew it, I was covering her rent and practically financing her entire lifestyle. I told myself it was temporary, that once she graduated, she'd pay me back or at least acknowledge everything I'd done. But looking back, I can see how naive I was to believe that. The family dinner where everything fell apart was supposed to be a simple catch-up. I didn't want to go, but I figured I could survive a few hours. By then, I was already starting to resent how much I had sacrificed for Lauren, but her comment that night, that I was a loser, was the final straw. It was the moment I realized that, to her, all my sacrifices meant nothing. I wasn't her big brother trying to support her. I was just the person funding her life. When Lauren got into her dream college, I was proud of her, but I also knew what was coming. My parents had made it abundantly clear that they couldn't afford to pay for her education, and their subtle hints quickly turned into expectations. Family takes care of family, they'd say, looking directly at me, as if my role in all of this had already been decided. I didn't have much. I was working as a mechanic and trying to save up for a house, but Lauren was my sister. I figured, what's the harm in helping? At first, the sacrifices were manageable. It started with small things, helping her buy textbooks or covering some groceries. I thought those would be one-time expenses. But as time went on, it didn't stop there. Soon, I was paying her rent, her utilities, and even her nights out when she claimed she needed to de-stress. Every request came with a promise. "I'll pay you back when I graduate." Or an excuse. "Mom and Dad just can't help right now." I wanted to believe her, so I kept saying yes. What made it worse was the way my parents acted, as if this was my responsibility, as though I owed it to Lauren simply because I was her older brother. They'd constantly remind me, "She's building her future. You should be proud to help." Proud? I was exhausted. While Lauren was out enjoying dinners and weekends off, I was breaking my back working 2 jobs just to make sure she could stay in school. At the same time, Lauren didn't seem to grasp the weight of what I was doing for her. She acted as if this was normal, like it was my duty to fund her lifestyle. She never stopped to ask how I was doing or if I needed help. Instead, she posted pictures on social media of fancy dinners, weekend trips, and a lifestyle I couldn't even afford for myself. Every time I saw one of those posts, I'd tell myself it was worth it because she'd eventually graduate and everything would pay off. But deep down, I was starting to resent the fact that my life was on hold while hers seemed to be moving full speed ahead on my dime. As time went on, Lauren's sense of entitlement became impossible to ignore. While I was scraping by, skipping meals, and working late shifts to keep her afloat, she was flaunting her lifestyle on social media. Pictures of designer handbags, trendy shoes, and fancy dinners filled her feed, things I could never afford for myself. It wasn't just the material things. It was the carefree attitude she had about it all, as if she was completely unaware that I was the one funding her lifestyle. At first, I tried to rationalize her spending. Maybe she had picked up a part-time job. Maybe she was just overdoing it for appearances. But when I finally asked her about it, she brushed it off. "Everyone at school dresses like this. she said casually. I don't want to look like I don't fit in. It didn't sit right with me. Here I was working myself to the bone, and she was worried about appearances? The lack of awareness was mind-boggling. It wasn't just her spending habits that grated on me. It was the way she treated me. I had become her personal ATM. She never asked how I was doing, never thanked me, and never offered to help. Every conversation revolved around her problems, her professors, her roommates, or her workload. If I tried to bring up my own struggles, she either ignored me or changed the subject. My parents weren't any better. Whenever I hinted at how much I was sacrificing, they'd guilt me into silence. She's your sister, my mom would say. You should be proud to help her. But there was nothing to be proud of. Lauren wasn't working hard, or even trying to meet me halfway. She was living in luxury, while I was left with nothing. No savings, no free time, and no acknowledgement of what I was giving up for her. I kept telling myself it would all be worth it once she graduated, but the resentment was building. Every time I saw her living a life I couldn't have, paid for by me, I felt a little more bitterness creeping in. How could she be so blind to what I was going through? How could my parents continue to enable this? All I wanted was a little gratitude, a small sign that she understood the sacrifices I was making. But instead, all I got was her entitlement. The resentment I had buried for years finally came to a head when Lauren dropped her most outrageous request yet. One evening, during one of her usual calls to talk about herself, she casually mentioned that she wanted to study abroad for a semester. I think it would be such a great experience, she said, her tone light and carefree, as if she were talking about grabbing coffee. Then she added, without hesitation, the program costs a little more, but it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, right? I sat there gripping the phone, stunned. Was she serious? I could barely keep up with her regular expenses, and now she wanted me to pay for her to study abroad? She didn't even bother to ask if I could afford it. She simply assumed I'd figure it out, as I always had. My mind raced with anger and disbelief. I had been skipping meals, pulling double shifts, and putting my dreams on hold so she could have a better future, and now she was asking for more? Hoping for some backup, I brought it up to my parents, thinking maybe they'd finally see how unreasonable this had become. But instead of supporting me, they doubled down. This is an incredible opportunity, my mom said enthusiastically. You'll figure it out. You always do. I was floored. There was no concern for my struggles, no acknowledgement of the toll this was taking on me, just the same old expectation that I'd keep sacrificing because that was my role in the family. Meanwhile, Lauren's entitlement became even harder to stomach. She called to complain about trivial things, like her roommate borrowing her shoes or the campus cafeteria not having real lattes. It was the kind of petty nonsense that made me want to scream, but I held it in. What pushed me over the edge was her attitude toward my hard work. She'd laugh and joke about how I was always working, saying things like, "You're practically married to your job." It was as if she didn't even see me as a person, just a resource to be used. The final straw came during a family dinner. Lauren was back home for a break and decided to bring up the study abroad program again, going on and on about how amazing it would be. Then, with a smile, she looked right at me and said, "I hope you're ready for a little extra work, big brother. These programs don't come cheap." My blood boiled. How could she be so audacious? I tried to keep my tone light and said, "Maybe you should get a part-time job." She laughed in my face. "A part-time job? That's funny. I'm too busy with school." That was it. The years of pent-up frustration, resentment, and exhaustion spilled out of me. I put down my fork and stared at her. "You think I'm just going to keep funding your lifestyle forever while you sit around doing nothing?" I said, my voice shaking with anger. The room fell silent. Lauren's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of shock. I could see the disbelief on my parents' faces, but I didn't care. I was done. Done being taken for granted. Done sacrificing for someone who didn't appreciate it. Done with the whole charade. That dinner marked the breaking point. For the first time, I stood up for myself, and I knew there was no going back. The family dinner was supposed to be a casual get-together, but I already dreaded going. My parents had invited me over to catch up, and Lauren was back in town for a short break from school. I knew what to expect. Hours of them doting on her while I sat in the background, invisible. Still, I went hoping I could get through a few hours without incident. Little did I know this would be the moment everything came to a head. From the moment I arrived, it was all about Lauren. My parents fussed over her, asking about her classes, her social life, and whether she needed anything else for school. I sat quietly, waiting for anyone, to ask how I was doing. But of course, that never happened. Halfway through dinner, Lauren brought up the study abroad program again, talking endlessly about how amazing it would be. She described it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and kept mentioning how all her friends were doing it. Then she turned to me and said, with the same entitled smile I had grown to despise, "I hope you're ready for a little extra work, big brother. These programs don't come cheap." I froze. I couldn't believe the audacity. She said it so casually, so confidently, as if I existed solely to fund her dreams. I tried to keep my tone light and said, "Maybe you should get a part-time job." Lauren laughed in my face. "A part-time job? That's funny. I'm too busy with school." That was the breaking point. I put my fork down and stared at her. "You're joking, right? You think I'm just going to keep funding your lifestyle forever while you sit around doing nothing?" The room fell silent. My parents looked at me like I'd just cursed at the dinner table, and Lauren's jaw dropped. For once, she didn't have a snarky comeback ready. After a moment, she snapped. "What's your problem? You've always been so bitter. Just because your life isn't going anywhere doesn't mean you have to take it out on me." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. After everything I'd done for her, sacrificing my time, my money, and my dreams, this was how she saw me? A failure? A bitter loser? I could feel my blood boiling, but I wasn't going to let her have the last word. "Bitter?" I said, leaning forward. "You think I'm bitter because my life isn't going anywhere? My life isn't going anywhere because I've been too busy funding yours." My parents immediately jumped to her defense. "That's inappropriate," my mom said sharply. "You're her brother. It's your job to support her." I let out a bitter laugh. "My job? When did it become my job to work 2 jobs so she could live in luxury? When did it become my job to sacrifice my future so she could have hers handed to her on a silver platter?" Lauren folded her arms and rolled her eyes. "Oh, here it is," she muttered. "The martyr routine. That was it. I was done." "You know what?" I said, standing up. "Go ahead and call me a failure, Lauren. At least I worked for everything I have. What have you done? Nothing. You sit around spending my money while you pretend you're better than me." I turned to my parents, "And you two are no better. You've enabled her selfishness at every turn, and I'm done playing along. I'm not paying for anything anymore. Not her rent, not her tuition, nothing." The silence was deafening. Lauren's face went pale, and for the first time, she looked genuinely shocked. "You can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "How am I supposed to live?" "Figure it out," I said, grabbing my jacket. "I've been doing it for years. Maybe it's time you learned how." With that, I walked out, leaving behind the stunned silence of my family. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had finally stood up for myself, and there was no turning back. The fallout from that family dinner came faster than I expected. The next morning, my phone was flooded with texts and missed calls, first from Lauren, then from my parents. Lauren's messages started off passive-aggressive, dripping with sarcasm. "Thanks for ruining dinner. Hope you feel good about leaving your own sister out to dry." When I didn't respond, her tone quickly shifted to guilt trips. "You're really going to leave me like this after everything I've been through?" she wrote, as if she hadn't spent years living off my paycheck without a second thought. I ignored her messages entirely. Next, my mom called. Her voice was heavy with disappointment, a tone I'd heard 100 times before. "I don't know what's gotten into you," she said. "Lauren needs your help. She's your sister." I cut her off. "She's been my financial responsibility for years." I snapped. "It's time for her to grow up and take care of herself." Mom sighed, clearly unimpressed. "You're tearing this family apart," she said before hanging up. Later that day, my dad called, sounding just as angry. "You're being selfish," he said. "You're punishing her for no reason. What's she going to do now?" His tone was accusatory, as if I was the one who had wronged her. "Get a job," I replied bluntly. "Like the rest of us." That was the end of that conversation. But the real kicker came when Lauren's landlord called me. Apparently, She hadn't paid her rent, and he was reaching out to me because she had told him I was the one who usually paid. I took a deep breath and said firmly, "She's not my problem anymore. You need to talk to her." I hung up, feeling a mix of anger and liberation. For the first time, I wasn't cleaning up her mess. A few days later, Lauren showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked completely panicked, a far cry from the confident, entitled person I was used to. "You can't just cut me off," she said the moment I opened the door. I leaned against the doorframe and replied, "Yes, I can." She started rambling about how she was going to lose her apartment and how she couldn't possibly move back home because our parents didn't have room for her. I stood firm. "Not my problem," I said flatly. Lauren's jaw dropped. "You're my brother," she shouted, as if that was reason enough for me to keep funding her lifestyle. I met her gaze and said calmly, "And for years, I've been more than that. I've been your safety net, your bank, and your excuse to avoid growing up. But I'm done. You need to figure this out on your own." Her eyes welled up with tears, and for a brief moment, I almost felt bad. But then I remembered the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, and the endless guilt trips, and I knew I had made the right choice. Lauren stormed off, and I closed the door, feeling a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I had drawn a line. The fallout was far from over, but at least now, I was standing up for myself. A few days after the family dinner, Lauren showed up at my apartment, completely unannounced. When I opened the door, I barely recognized her. She looked disheveled and desperate, a far cry from the confident, entitled person I had been dealing with for years. She wasted no time. "You can't just cut me off like this," she blurted out, her voice shaking. "I'm going to lose my apartment. What am I supposed to do?" I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my expression calm. "That's not my problem," I said flatly. Her jaw dropped as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "Not your problem? You're my brother," she shouted, as though that alone should guilt me into reversing my decision. But I had finally reached my limit, and I wasn't about to let her pull me back into her endless cycle of entitlement. "For years, I've been more than your brother," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "I've been your safety net, your bank, your excuse to avoid responsibility. I worked 2 jobs so you could live your dream, and the one time I asked for respect, you called me a failure. So no, Lauren, it's not my problem anymore." Lauren blinked, her face crumbling as if she had never imagined I'd stand up to her. "I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, trying to backtrack. "I was upset, and I just wasn't thinking. Her words might have worked on me years ago, but not now." "You never think," I shot back. "You never think about anyone but yourself. You used me. You used Mom and Dad. And now you're panicking because you finally have to face the consequences of your choices." At that, Lauren's demeanor shifted. Her voice rose in frustration. "You're being cruel," she snapped, tears streaming down her face. "You're supposed to help family. That's what family does." I took a deep breath, determined not to let her manipulate me. "Family supports each other," I said firmly. "They don't take advantage of each other and call it love. Until you figure that out, don't bother coming back here." She started sobbing, big dramatic cries that might have worked on someone else, but I wasn't falling for it anymore. "You need to figure this out for yourself," I said. "Get a job, budget your money, do whatever it takes, but leave me out of it." With that, I closed the door, cutting off whatever excuse she was about to make. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking back control of my life. It wasn't easy to shut the door on my own sister, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Lauren had spent too long depending on me, and it was time for her to learn how to stand on her own 2 feet. The family backlash came in full force after I stood my ground. My parents were furious, and they made no effort to hide it. The next day, my mom called, her voice heavy with disappointment. "How could you do this to your sister?" she demanded. "She's struggling, and you've abandoned her when she needed you the most." I had heard this guilt trip countless times before, but this time, I wasn't going to take it. "Struggling?" I shot back. "She's been living off my paycheck for years, acting like she's royalty while I work myself to the bone. Maybe it's time she learned what struggling actually looks like." My dad wasn't any better. When he called later that day, he accused me of being heartless and selfish. "What are you trying to prove?" he barked. You're punishing her for no reason." His words stung, but I stayed calm. "I'm not punishing her," I replied. "I'm just done being taken advantage of. She needs to get a job like the rest of us." The backlash didn't stop with my parents. Word spread quickly through the family, and suddenly, relatives I hadn't spoken to in years were chiming in. I got messages from cousins and even distant aunts, all parroting the same sentiment. "Family comes first," or "It's not fair to let Lauren struggle." Some were polite, others downright accusatory, but none of them knew the full story. For the most part, I ignored them, though one particularly nosy aunt called to lecture me about my responsibilities. After I explained everything, how I had been paying Lauren's rent, tuition, and expenses while she flaunted her entitlement, she fell silent. "She really expected you to keep paying for all of that?" she finally asked, disbelief evident in her voice. "Welcome to my world," I replied. Lauren, of course, didn't let the opportunity for social drama pass her by. She plastered her social media with vague, passive-aggressive posts. "Some people only care about themselves," and "It hurts the most when family lets you down." She even started a GoFundMe page claiming she had been blindsided by an unexpected financial crisis and needed help to cover her rent. Her friends rushed to comment, offering their sympathy and asking how they could help, but the donations barely trickled in. Apparently, the same people who loved joining her for fancy dinners weren't as eager to fund her lifestyle. The whole situation was surreal. Watching my family and Lauren's friends rally around her, blindly supporting her victim narrative, made me realize just how much I had enabled her behavior over the years. But for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of their opinions. Let them think what they want, I told myself. I knew the truth, and I wasn't going to let anyone guilt me into going back to the way things were. After I cut Lauren off, she moved back in with our parents, who immediately picked up where I left off, enabling her every whim. They treated her like a helpless child, bending over backward to make sure she didn't feel the consequences of her actions. From what I heard through the family grapevine, they were using what little savings they had left to cover her expenses, effectively draining themselves to maintain her lifestyle. It was frustrating but unsurprising. They had been coddling her for years, so why would this be any different? Lauren, of course, wasn't satisfied. A mutual friend told me that she overheard Lauren complaining about the food at home, saying, "Mom and Dad don't cook real meals," as if she were staying at a five-star resort. She even joked that they should hire someone to take care of her, since I wasn't around to do it anymore. It was absurd, yet entirely in character. Lauren had never learned to fend for herself, because my parents had always swooped in to shield her from the realities of adulthood. Things took a darker turn when Lauren, in her typical fashion, decided to dig an even deeper hole. She maxed out a credit card in my parents' name, using it to go on a shopping spree. I could only shake my head when I heard about it. Rather than confronting her and putting a stop to her behavior, my parents called me, practically begging me to help. "We can't make the payments on our own," my mom said, her voice pleading. "You have to step in." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. After all their efforts to defend Lauren and vilify me, they now had the audacity to come crawling back. "This is your mess to clean up," I told them firmly. "You chose to support her. You chose to ignore her behavior. Now you're dealing with the consequences." For once, they didn't argue. Maybe they realized I wasn't going to swoop in and save the day like I had so many times before. Or maybe they were just too tired to fight. Either way, it was a clear reminder of why I had to step away. Lauren's entitlement wasn't just her fault. It was a product of years of enabling by our parents. And now, they were paying the price for it. As hard as it was to watch, I knew I couldn't let myself get dragged back into the chaos. Cutting Lauren off was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but as time went on, it became clear that it was the right one. After years of sacrificing my time, money, and sanity to keep her afloat, I finally chose to put myself first. It wasn't easy, especially with the backlash from my parents and relatives, but for the first time, I felt free from the weight of her entitlement and the family's expectations. As for Lauren, her life continued to spiral. Without me footing the bill, she was forced to move back in with our parents. They continued to enable her, but even their resources weren't endless. The last I heard, She was still complaining about the lack of real meals at home and expecting to be pampered. Her entitlement hadn't changed, but her social circle had. Word about her failed GoFundMe campaign and her excessive spending habits had spread, and many of her friends distanced themselves. Without someone to pick up the tab, she had little to offer. The tipping point for my parents came when Lauren maxed out their credit card on a shopping spree. They were left scrambling to make payments, finally realizing just how much they'd enabled her over the years. They tried to rope me back in, pleading for help, but I held firm. "This is your mess," I told them. "You chose to let her act this way, and now you're facing the consequences." For once, they didn't argue, and I could see they were beginning to understand what I had been dealing with all along. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my own life. It wasn't easy repairing the damage from years of financial strain, but I slowly began to save money, pursue my goals, and create a future for myself. Cutting ties with Lauren and my parents wasn't just about finances. It was about reclaiming my time and emotional energy. Without their constant drama, I could finally breathe and think clearly. Though I occasionally felt a twinge of guilt, it was outweighed by the relief of knowing I was no longer trapped in their toxic cycle. Lauren had been given every opportunity to succeed, but she chose entitlement over gratitude and responsibility. My parents had enabled her behavior for years, but now they were left to deal with the aftermath. The last I heard, Lauren was still living at home, stuck in the same cycle of excuses and entitlement. My parents continued to enable her, though their resources were quickly running out. Part of me felt sorry for them. They had made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. But mostly I felt relieved. I had finally broken free from their expectations and reclaimed control of my life. It took years of sacrifice and one painful confrontation, but I came out stronger and more determined to live life on my own terms.